6 people were murdered while they slept. 6 innocent lives ended in a single night of violence so brutal that investigators struggled to comprehend it. A small town woke up to discover that an entire family, plus 2 young guests, had been slaughtered in their beds with an axe. The killer walked through that house room by room, striking down children, striking down adults, methodically extinguishing every life under that roof. And then the killer vanished. No arrest was ever made. No charges were ever filed. Over a century has passed, and we still do not know who committed one of the most horrific mass murders in American history. The evidence existed. The investigation happened, but justice never came. Imagine waking up in a quiet Midwestern town to discover that your neighbors, an entire family you saw just yesterday, were brutally killed overnight. That the children you watched playing in the yard would never play again. That someone walked among you, lived among you, and committed unspeakable evil while everyone else slept peacefully. Today we're diving into the Villisca Axe murders of 1912, a case so disturbing that it traumatized an entire community and spawned over a century of theories, investigations, and unanswered questions. This is the story of 8 victims who deserved protection and received none. A killer who was never caught, and a small town that would never feel safe again. This case will show you how even the most brutal evidence can lead nowhere, how small town secrets can bury the truth, and how sometimes evil walks away unpunished. To understand what happened and why this case remains unsolved, we need to go back to June 1912 to a tiny farming community in southwestern Iowa called Villisca. This was a town of maybe 2,000 people. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors were rarely locked, where children played freely in the streets without fear. It was rural America at its most innocent, a place that seemed untouched by the violence and chaos of the rapidly modernizing world. But that innocence was an illusion. Villisca in 1912 was not the peaceful paradise it appeared to be. Beneath the surface of neighborly politeness simmered tensions, jealousies, affairs, and grudges that people worked hard to keep hidden. This was an era when reputation meant everything, when scandals could destroy families, when dirty secrets were buried deep. The police force consisted of a town marshal and maybe 1 or 2 deputies, men with no formal training in criminal investigation. When a serious crime occurred, they were expected to figure it out using common sense and whatever help they could get from county or state authorities. There were no crime labs, no forensic experts, no FBI to call for assistance. If you wanted to solve a murder in 1912, you relied on witness testimony, physical evidence you could see with your naked eye, and confessions. The problem was that in a case like this, where an entire family was wiped out in one night, there were no witnesses. The only people who knew what happened were dead. This limitation would prove catastrophic to the investigation. The Moore family lived in a modest 2-story frame house on the east side of Villisca. Josiah Moore, known to everyone as Joe, was 43 years old and worked as a successful businessman in the farm equipment industry. He was well respected in the community, known as a hard worker and devoted father. His wife, Sarah, was 39 years old, a homemaker who was active in the local Presbyterian church and devoted her life to raising their 4 children. Their oldest child was Herman, age 11, a bright boy who helped his father around the property and was doing well in school. Then came Catherine, age 10, who everyone called Catherine or Katie, a sweet girl with a gentle disposition who loved reading and playing with her younger siblings. Next was Boyd, age 7, full of energy and mischief like most boys his age. always running around the yard with the family dog. The youngest was Paul, just 5 years old, still small enough to climb into his mother's lap, still young enough to believe the world was a safe and wonderful place. On the night of June 9th, 1912, the Moore family also had 2 guests staying over. Lena Stillinger was 12 years old, and her sister Ina was 8. They were the daughters of a neighbor family, and they had asked permission to spend the night at the Moore house. After attending a special children's program at church that evening, Sarah Moore had agreed, happy to have the girls stay over. It would be a fun sleepover for Catherine and the Stillinger sisters. What no one knew as they settled into bed that night was that none of them would see the morning. These were 8 innocent people going about their ordinary lives with no idea that someone was watching, waiting, planning their murders. Sunday, June 9th, 1912, seemed like a perfectly normal day. The Moore family attended church services that evening, where the children participated in a program called Children's Day Exercises. It was a small town event, the kind of wholesome activity that defined life in Villisca. Afterward, the family walked home together through the quiet streets around 10 o'clock. Lena and Ina Stillinger came with them, excited about their sleepover. Neighbors saw the Moore family entering their house that night. Lights were on for a while as the family got ready for bed. Then, sometime around midnight, the house went dark. Everything appeared peaceful, but inside that house, something terrible was about to happen. Investigators later determined that sometime between midnight and 5 in the morning, someone entered the Moore house. The intruder came prepared, carrying an axe or finding one on the property. Moving through the dark house with purpose, the killer went room by room, attacking each victim while they slept. Josiah and Sarah were struck first in their downstairs bedroom. Then the killer moved upstairs, where the 4 Moore children and 2 Stillinger girls were sleeping. One by one, in separate rooms, each child was attacked. The blows were so brutal that blood splattered on the walls and ceilings. The killer struck each victim multiple times, far more than necessary to cause death, suggesting rage or frenzy, or perhaps an attempt to ensure no one survived. When the killing was finished, the murderer did something strange. Instead of fleeing immediately, the killer spent time in the house covering windows with clothing, covering mirrors with fabric, covering the faces of some victims with bed sheets. The killer apparently washed at the kitchen sink, left the murder weapon propped against the wall, and then simply walked out, locking the door behind them. The next morning, Mary Peckham, a neighbor, noticed that the Moore house was unusually quiet. By 8:30, no one had emerged to do morning chores. The curtains were still drawn. This was odd enough that Mary sent her son to check on the family. When he knocked and received no answer, he tried the door and found it locked. Growing concerned, Mary contacted Josiah's brother, who had a key to the house. When they entered through the back door shortly before noon, they discovered a scene of unspeakable horror. Room by room, they found the bodies. All 8 victims had been killed with an axe. The attack had been so violent that some victims were nearly unrecognizable. Before we continue with what happened next, I need to pause here for a moment, because I know what you're feeling right now when you hear about children being murdered in their sleep, when you think about how terrified they might have been if they woke up, or how mercifully unaware they might have remained. It's almost unbearable. 4 children from one family, 2 young girls sleeping over, all of them gone in one night of senseless violence. I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt that deep rage when you hear about crimes against children? That feeling that whoever did this deserves no mercy? You're not alone in that feeling. And it's important that we honor these victims by remembering they were real children with real futures that were stolen. If this case is affecting you, if you're sitting there thinking about how those children deserved protection and justice, just type in the comments, "Children deserve justice." Those 3 words. Because when you do that, you're standing up for victims who can no longer speak. You're showing this community that we haven't forgotten. And you're reminding the world that some crimes can never be forgiven, even if they're never solved. Thank you for being here. Now, let's continue with the investigation. And I need to warn you, it's about to get incredibly frustrating. The investigation into the Villisca axe murders began immediately, but was compromised from the start. The first and most damaging error was that the crime scene was not secured. Word spread quickly through the small town that something terrible had happened at the Moore house, and dozens of curious townspeople entered the house before authorities could stop them. People walked through rooms, touched objects, contaminated evidence, and destroyed any chance of a clean forensic investigation. By the time state investigators arrived later that day, the scene had been so thoroughly trampled that much of the physical evidence was useless. The murder weapon was identified as an axe that had been stored in the Moore house itself, meaning the killer had not brought a weapon but had found one on the property. The axe had been wiped clean, though traces of blood remained. There were no clear fingerprints, no obvious clues pointing to a specific individual. Investigators searched for signs of forced entry and found none, leading to theories that either the killer had a key or the doors had been left unlocked, which was common in Villisca. The question became, who would want to murder an entire family? The most immediate theory focused on Reverend George Kelly, a traveling Presbyterian minister who had been in Villisca that night and had attended the children's program at church. Kelly was known to have mental health issues and had exhibited strange behavior. He left town on the early morning train just hours after the murders, which some found suspicious. He also allegedly made statements that suggested knowledge of the crime. Kelly was arrested and tried twice for the murders, but both trials ended without conviction. The evidence against him was purely circumstantial, and many believed he was simply a mentally ill man who became an easy scapegoat. Another major suspect was Frank Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and state senator who had a bitter grudge against Josiah Moore. The 2 men had once been business partners, but had a falling out, and Moore had left to start a competing business. Jones allegedly harbored deep resentment and may have wanted revenge. Some investigators theorized that Jones hired a hitman named William Mansfield to carry out the murders. Mansfield was a known criminal who had been implicated in similar axe murders in other states. The theory suggested that Jones paid Mansfield to kill Josiah Moore, and Mansfield killed the entire family to eliminate witnesses. But this theory also fell apart under scrutiny. There was no concrete evidence linking either Jones or Mansfield to the scene. No confession was ever obtained. No witness could place them at the Moore house that night. The case also became entangled in small-town politics and personal vendettas. Different investigators pursued different theories based on their own biases and allegiances. Evidence was mishandled or lost. Witness statements were contradictory. The longer the investigation went on, the more muddied it became, until it was nearly impossible to separate fact from rumor, evidence from speculation. Thanks for sticking with this difficult case. If you want more deep dives into history's darkest mysteries, hit that like button and subscribe. Now here's where everything gets even more complicated. One aspect of the case that has troubled investigators for decades is the connection to similar murders that occurred around the same time period. Between 1911 and 1912, there were at least 8 other axe murders in the Midwest that bore striking similarities to the Villisca case. Entire families killed in their sleep with an axe. Crime scenes where the killer covered mirrors and windows. Victims found with their faces covered. These cases occurred in different states, suggesting a serial killer traveling through the Midwest, entering homes at night and committing mass murder. If this theory is correct, then the Villisca murders were not an isolated incident motivated by personal grudge, but rather the work of a serial killer whose identity was never discovered. This would explain why no local suspects were ever successfully prosecuted. The killer was not from Villisca at all, but was a transient predator who struck and moved on. However, this theory also has problems. The other axe murders stopped after 1912, suggesting either the killer died, was imprisoned for another crime, or simply stopped killing. Without DNA evidence or modern forensic techniques, it is impossible to definitively link these cases. The investigation dragged on for years, with various suspects arrested and released, various theories pursued and abandoned. The case officially went cold. Though it was never closed, the Villisca community was shattered by the murders. Families who once left their doors unlocked now barricaded themselves at night. Children who once played freely outside were kept close to home. Trust evaporated. Suspicion infected every relationship. Some people moved away, unable to live in a town where such horror had occurred and where the killer might still walk among them. The Moore house stood empty for years, a grim monument to unsolved violence. So who killed the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters on that June night in 1912? Over a century later, we still have no definitive answer, only theories that raise as many questions as they resolve. The Reverend Kelly theory has its supporters, those who believe his strange behavior, his presence in town that night, and his subsequent flight suggest guilt. Kelly had a history of mental illness and bizarre religious obsessions. Some believe he entered the Moore house in a fit of religious mania, convinced he was carrying out some divine mission. The problem with this theory is motive. Why would Kelly, even in a disturbed state, target this specific family? He had no known connection to the Moores beyond attending the same church event that evening. And would a mentally ill minister really have the presence of mind to clean the murder weapon, cover mirrors and windows, and lock the door on his way out? These calculated actions suggest someone more organized than a man in the grip of religious psychosis. The Frank Jones revenge theory is compelling in different ways. Jones had clear motive. He hated Josiah Moore for leaving his business and becoming a competitor. Jones had the resources to hire someone like Mansfield to carry out a murder, and the brutality of the crime, the overkill, the rage evident in the repeated blows, all suggest someone acting on deep personal hatred. But again, the evidence is thin. No financial records show Jones paying Mansfield. No witness places Mansfield in Villisca that night. And if this was a hired killing meant to eliminate Josiah Moore, why kill the entire family and 2 additional children who were just guests? Professional hitmen typically make murders look like accidents or robberies, not scenes of obvious massacre. The serial killer theory explains the crime's randomness and brutality. If the Villisca murders were part of a string of similar killings across the Midwest, then the lack of local suspects makes sense. The killer was a stranger passing through, someone with no connection to the victims, someone driven by compulsions we can only imagine. This theory fits the pattern of other unsolved axe murders from the same period, but it leaves us with the chilling question: who was this person and what happened to them? Did they die in 1912 ending their killing spree? Were they institutionalized or imprisoned? Or did they simply stop and live out their life, never caught, never punished? Then there are darker theories, whispered possibilities that involve multiple killers, sexual motives related to the young girls, or cover-ups involving prominent citizens whose guilt was hidden to protect the town's reputation. Some researchers have noted oddities in how the Stillinger girls' bodies were positioned, suggesting the killer may have had specific interest in them. This has led to theories about predators, about secrets involving abuse, about motives that were too shameful for 1912 investigators to pursue publicly. The truth is that we will likely never know with certainty what happened that night. Too much time has passed. All the witnesses are dead. All the original suspects are dead. The physical evidence that might have solved the case with modern technology was destroyed or lost decades ago. More than 100 years have passed since that June night when 8 people were murdered in their beds. The investigation was one of the most extensive of its era. Dozens of suspects were interrogated. 2 men stood trial. Countless theories were proposed, and yet no one was ever convicted. No one ever paid for those 8 deaths. The killer, or killers, got away with it completely. The Moore House still stands in Villisca, now operating as a museum and paranormal investigation site, a macabre tourist attraction where people pay to spend the night in the rooms where children were murdered. Some find this respectful, a way of keeping the victim's memory alive. Others find it exploitative, turning tragedy into entertainment. The 8 victims are buried in the Villisca Cemetery. Their graves are marked with simple headstones that bear their names and dates, but cannot convey the horror of their deaths or the injustice of their unsolved murders. Josiah and Sarah Moore, who worked hard and raised their children with love. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul Moore, children who never got to grow up, never got to live the lives they should have had. Lena and Ina Stillinger, 2 little girls who just wanted to have a fun sleepover with friends. Justice never came for them. Closure never came for their surviving family members. The truth never emerged from the darkness. Some cases remain unsolved, not because investigators didn't care or didn't try, but because sometimes evidence isn't enough. Sometimes witnesses don't exist, and sometimes killers are clever enough or lucky enough to escape justice. This is one of those cases. Thank you for listening to this heartbreaking story, for remembering these 8 victims as more than just names in a notorious case, for bearing witness to lives that were stolen and justice that was never served. If you have thoughts about what really happened that night, if you believe one theory over another, or if this case has affected you the way it's affected so many others over the past century, share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone, and these victims deserve to be remembered. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you in the next case.